Hey everyone, in today's video we'll be diving into the glamorous and scandalous world of the dollar princesses, wealthy American heiresses who crossed the Atlantic in the late 19th and early 20th centuries to marry into Europe's aristocracy. These marriages weren't just about romance, they were high-stakes exchanges of money for titles, estates and social prestige. So, join me as we explore all of this and much more. First, we are looking into the archetype and the most famous dollar princess, the $100 million bride, Consuelo Vanderbilt. Consuelo Vanderbilt was born in New York City on the 2nd of March 1877. Her father was William Kissam Vanderbilt, a scion of one of America's wealthiest families of the Gilded Age. Vanderbilt was a railway executive, one who famously renamed the P.T. Barnum Great Roman Hippodrome in New York as Madison Square Garden in 1879, 2 years after Consuelo was born. Her mother was Alva Erskine Smith, a future leader of the American suffragist movement. Consuelo was named after her godmother, her mother's closest friend, Consuelo Iznaga, who was half Cuban. Despite being born into an extremely affluent family, Consuelo's upbringing was less than ideal, especially by modern standards. Growing up, she was required to wear a steel rod along her back to ensure that she had the straightest possible posture. Her mother imposed this and was a generally domineering figure, one who dictated what Consuelo wore and was not shy of using physical punishment if Consuelo disobeyed her. Also, her childhood was pretty isolated, as she was homeschooled by a series of private tutors and teachers. One must understand the wider family dynamic in order to comprehend how Consuelo's life played out in the ensuing decades. She was born into the Vanderbilt family, one of the richest and most powerful families in Gilded Age America, who owed their wealth to Consuelo's great-grandfather, Cornelius Vanderbilt. Cornelius had built his first fortune in the 1830s and 1840s by becoming the most significant figure in the shipping and transport industry in New York City and along the Hudson River. He used the money he made from these ventures to diversify into the railroad industry, laying down tens of thousands of kilometers of railway lines across the United States in the 1850s and 1860s. By the 1870s, shortly before his death, he was believed to have become the richest man in the world, though these things were harder to quantify in the 19th century than they are today. Consuelo's grandfather, Cornelius' son, William Henry Vanderbilt, inherited most of the Vanderbilt fortune when his father died in 1877, but William died just a few years later in 1885, and thereafter, the Vanderbilt fortune was divided out amongst an ever-growing number of family members. Yet the primary beneficiaries of William's will were Cornelius Vanderbilt II, Consuelo's uncle, and her father, who inherited somewhere in the region of $55 million, a sum equivalent to nearly $2 billion in today's money. Thus, Consuelo was born into a family of immense wealth. Unfortunately, that wealth would serve as much to shape her life negatively as it did positively. From the beginning of her teenage years, there was already speculation as to who Consuelo might marry. She was, after all, a daughter of one of the richest men in the world, and a marriage to her would bring enormous riches to any potential husband. Her mother was intensely aware of this, and was determined that Consuelo would enter into a high-status marriage. Moreover, as she became a young woman, it was evident that the Vanderbilt heiress was not just immensely rich, but also very attractive. J.M. Barrie, the author of Peter Pan, once joked of her, "I would stand all day in the street to see Consuelo get into her carriage." By the time she entered her late teens, Consuelo's mother seems to have determined that her daughter would marry into the British aristocracy. She was not alone in this, as many American families became immensely wealthy in the second half of the 19th century. They used their daughters as what became known as dollar princesses, whereby a rich American heiress married a British aristocrat. New money in America joined with old world nobility in these unions. Yet, There was another reason for Alva's insistence. In March 1895, Alva had divorced her husband William Vanderbilt and as a result had been exiled from high society. Desperate to regain her social standing, Alva needed Consuelo to marry a noble of very high standing, and luckily for her, there was an ideal candidate for such a union. This was Charles Spencer Churchill, the 9th Duke of Marlborough. Marlborough was a descendant of one of the most acclaimed noble families of Britain, the first Duke having led the British war effort during the War of Spanish Succession in the early 18th century. Back then he had built one of Britain's grandest estates, known as Blenheim Palace. However, the Spencer Churchills had fallen into some economic distress by the late 19th century, despite the great honour of their household. Thus, the match between the 9th Duke and Consuelo was a marriage of convenience. Marlborough would obtain the funding he needed to, as he later claimed, save Blenheim Palace, while the Vanderbilts would buy their way into the British aristocracy, and Alva would regain her social standing. Nevertheless, Consuelo did not enter into the marriage willingly. When it was first brought up by her mother Alva, she had already become secretly engaged to Winthrop Rutherford, a socialite of the era who was significantly older than Consuelo. But Consuelo was completely intimidated and beholden to her mother's wishes in her youth, and despite having no interest in marrying Spencer Churchill, she agreed to the union at her mother's behest. Apparently, what tipped her into doing this was when her mother emotionally blackmailed her by claiming that her health was deteriorating dramatically, owing to Consuelo's unwillingness to agree to the marriage. The marriage was formalized on the 6th of November 1895, when Consuelo was just 18 years of age. Apparently, as she stood at the altar, she was weeping under her veil. As part of the arrangement, Marlborough received $2.5 million worth of Vanderbilt railway stock, a sum equivalent to nearly $100 million today. But while the union was enormously beneficial for the Spencer Churchills from a financial perspective, it was a disaster from a personal viewpoint. Both Consuelo and Charles had to abandon relationships they had been in as a result of the marriage, and they did not take well to one another. Indeed, Alva Vanderbilt, Consuelo's mother, freely admitted in later years that she forced her daughter to marry Marlborough. Both Consuelo and Charles quickly became involved with other people. She entered a relationship with Reginald Fellows, a cousin of Marlborough's, while the Duke took to an American socialite by the name of Gladys Marie Deacon as his mistress. By 1906, the Duke and his wife had effectively separated, though they remained officially married until the 1920s. Despite the unhappy nature of the marriage, it did result in 2 children. John Albert was born on the 18th of September 1897. He would become the 10th Duke of Marlborough in 1934. A second boy, Ivor, followed just a year after John on the 14th of October 1898. Ivor served with distinction in France during the First World War and was awarded the French Legion of Honor. Despite the inauspicious nature of her marriage to the Duke of Marlborough, Consuelo was adored by the servants and staff at Blenheim Palace and the wider Oxfordshire region in which it was situated. In the 1890s and 1900s, she was perceived as the likeable and compassionate face of the Spencer Churchill lineage and gave generously to local maternity hospitals and charities focused on the poor. Nevertheless, Consuelo had married Marlborough at a time of increasing tensions in Europe's politics. The great powers had been locked in a bitter rivalry since the 1870s, driven by nationalist sentiment, a scramble for colonial possessions in Africa and Asia, and tensions between powers like Britain and Germany. By the early 20th century, 2 major armed alliances had developed across the continent, and in 1914, a regional crisis in the Balkans exploded into the First World War. Consuelo quickly involved herself in philanthropic and charitable work to aid the war effort in her adopted home. On the 5th of August 1914, just days after the outbreak of the war, she, along with Lou Hoover, the wife of the future US President Herbert Hoover, and Lady Randolph Churchill, established the American Women's War Relief Fund, an expatriate organization of American women designed to help fund and aid the war efforts in Britain. Over the next several years, Consuelo, through the American Women's War Relief Fund, was involved in fundraising from America to aid Britain. That is until the United States joined the war on Britain and France's side in 1917. The fund also used the money it had collected to finance knitting factories and workshops, and even equipped a military hospital. By the end of the war, what was termed the American Women's War Hospital had treated over 7,000 wounded soldiers. Consuelo and Charles eventually formalized their divorce in 1921. By then, Consuelo had long been involved in a relationship with Jacques Balsan. Balsan was a pioneer of aviation who had started working with balloons around the turn of the century, but who had then moved on to building airplanes after working with the Wright brothers, the first men to fly an airplane at Kitty Hawk in 1903. He and Consuelo had been involved with each other for many years prior to her obtaining the long-awaited divorce from Marlborough, and no sooner had this been finalized than Consuelo and Jacques married on the 4th of July 1921. He was 52 and she was 44. Consuelo's second marriage was a very happy one. In an autobiography which she had ghostwritten in the early 1950s, Consuelo referred to her time with Balsan as gold. They lived primarily in Paris in the 1920s and 1930s, and only barely escaped from the French capital in the face of the advancing Nazis in the summer of 1940, fleeing to Spain and then Portugal before heading to the United States. They settled in Florida thereafter, living out the remainder of their lives in America. Much of the later years of Consuelo and Jacques' marriage were lived in Manalapan, a small community in Palm Beach County in Florida. Here, she and her second husband constructed a large mansion which was named Casa Alva after Consuelo's mother. Built on an 150-acre estate, the house spanned 26,000 square feet, and when sold in the 1950s, was valued at $568,000, a sum equivalent to millions in today's money. Casa Alva has its own place in modern history. In 1946, Consuelo's cousin-in-law from her first marriage, the former British Prime Minister and wartime leader Winston Churchill, stayed here on his way to give a speech at Westminster College in Missouri. Thus, he is believed to have polished and practiced his famous Iron Curtain speech at Consuelo's home, one wherein he infamously described Soviet rule in Eastern and Central Europe as being like an iron curtain descending across the middle of Europe. Consuelo and Jacques spent much of their later marriage years in Florida, while also maintaining residences in New York and Long Island. In 1953, Consuelo's autobiography, which was ghostwritten by Stuart Preston, an American art critic and writer, appeared. Entitled The Glitter and the Gold, it provided an entertaining if highly selective account of her life and the world of a Gilded Age heiress. Jacques died on the 4th of November 1956 in New York City. His body was returned to France and buried in Paris. Sadly, her younger son Ivor died in September 1956 before reaching his 60th year, just weeks before Jacques. Following their passing, Consuelo sold Casa Alva and largely resided in New York and Long Island thereafter. Consuelo died at her home in Southampton on Long Island on the 6th of December 1964 at 87 years of age. Her body was returned to England and she was buried at St Martin's Church at Blaydon in Oxfordshire, not far from Blenheim Palace, next to her deceased son Ivor. Much of her fortune descended to her surviving son, the 10th Duke of Marlborough. Now, let's explore the life of the woman who is considered to be the first ever dollar princess, Lady Randolph Churchill. The woman who would one day become known as Lady Randolph Churchill was born in Brooklyn in New York City on the 9th of January 1854 as Janet Jerome, the daughter of Leonard Jerome, an American businessman, land speculator and sports figure. Her mother was Clarissa Jerome, née Hall, whose father Ambrose Hall was a landowner himself and sometime member of the New York legislature. As such, Jeanette, who quickly became known as Jenny in her youth, was born into a prominent New York society family as America began to head towards the Gilded Age and its ascent as the economic and political powerhouse of the Western Hemisphere. Jenny's youth was internationalist, with the Jerome family spending time between New York, Paris and England, where they sometimes visited the Isle of Wight, where the Jerome family was believed to have immigrated from. She learned to play the piano to a very high standard under the tutelage of Stephen Heller, a friend of the greatest composer and pianist of the mid-19th century, Frédéric Chopin, and also became noted for her attractive looks in her early adult years. On the 15th of April 1874, shortly after her 20th birthday, Jenny married Lord Randolph Henry Spencer Churchill at the British Embassy in Paris, France. He was the third son of John Winster Spencer Churchill, the 7th Duke of Marlborough, and a member of one of the most prominent aristocratic lineages in Britain. The pair had met over half a year earlier at a sailing regatta on the Isle of Wight, and they were engaged within days and married a few months later. Yet initially, it wasn't all smooth sailing. Lord Randolph's parents were shocked when his son announced his engagement, not just because he had just met the girl, but also as she was a tattooed American social climber of humble origins. Not what they had in mind. Of course, they tried to block the marriage, but once they learned just how wealthy her family was, it seems their opinion changed somewhat. Jenny's hand in marriage came with a huge dowry, equivalent to over $5 million today. Lord Randolph's parents knew the money would do them well, and so they reluctantly accepted. Thus she acquired a noble title, becoming known as Lady Randolph Churchill. Although the couple didn't know it at the time, they began a trend whereby American heiresses in the search of social status would marry into the British aristocracy. Many of these American heiresses were the daughters of self-made men. They were new money, and so well-established members of American high society shunned them, even if they were wealthier. If only these women had a noble title, that way they would instantly gain social status, and the family's position within high society would be secure. Meanwhile in Britain, many aristocrats were in need of cash, especially those with large estates to maintain. Therefore, from around the 1880s to the 1910s, hundreds of rich American heiresses flocked to England in the search of a husband. These women became known as the Dollar Princesses, and most view Lady Jenny Churchill as the first example of this. As Randolph's wife, Jenny was soon catapulted into British political life. Beginning in the late 1870s, Randolph increasingly became a vocal member of the backbenches of the Conservative Party in the UK Parliament, criticising the front bench of his own party at a time when they were being roundly beaten in elections by the Liberal Party of William E. Gladstone. By the 1880s, Randolph was one of the acknowledged heads of what became known as the Fourth Party, a splinter group within the Conservatives. In this role, he sought to popularise the idea that the Conservatives were not an elitist party of the aristocracy, but were as much representatives of the broader population as were the Liberals, a policy which proved successful and which led Randolph being appointed as Secretary of State for India in 1885. Jenny was supportive of Randolph's political career throughout the 1880s, campaigning with him during elections and playing an active role in the Primrose League, which Randolph and Sir Henry Drummond Wolff established in 1883 as a Conservative Party think tank. She also hosted funding parties, which were as much designed to keep an eye on her husband's political enemies as to foster allies, a development which has led some to speculate that Lady Randolph invented the concept of the dinner party of deadly enemies. Whatever the profile of the guests, Jenny was generally able to charm people, her social graces being remarked on by many. This helped aid her husband in his political life, for where Jenny was amiable, he was possessed of a brashness which many found off-putting. However, beyond the facade of public support, Jenny and Randolph's marriage was troubled. Much of this was owing to Randolph suffering from syphilis, a disease which had probably entered the secondary stage around the time he and Jenny married in the mid-1870s. Nevertheless, there were 2 children born out of their union, Winston and John. Winston arrived on the 30th of November 1874, just over 8 months after the pair's wedding, and it was likely he was conceived prior to their marriage, rather than being premature as some speculated at the time. John came 6 years later. There were constant rumours in the 1880s and 1890s about John's parentage. Many believed Lord Randolph was not the father, an almost completely unfounded piece of speculation, as he bore a likeness to his father and was also strikingly similar to his older brother. Yet, there were reasons for such rumours, for by that time, Jenny's many affairs were a matter of public knowledge. The most serious of these was with Count Kingsky, a diplomat attached to the London Embassy of the Empire of Austria-Hungary. Others whom she was linked with at the time included the Prince of Wales, the future King Edward VII, Prince Milan Abramovich of Serbia, and Herbert von Bismarck, the son of the famed Chancellor of Germany, Otto von Bismarck. In the notorious society gossip circles of late 19th century London, Jenny increasingly became known as Lady Jane Snatcher, on account of her repeated infidelities with married men, though as years went by, she did become more discreet. Randolph's career declined in the late 1880s and early 1890s, in part owing to repeated assertions of his disloyalty towards the Conservative Prime Minister, Lord Salisbury, and also because of his own declining health. The latter was owing to the syphilis which had deteriorated throughout his adult life, and also a possible brain tumour and multiple sclerosis. He was not aided by the fact that his doctor prescribed the consumption of mercury to treat his syphilis. By the mid-1890s, things were bad enough that he and Jenny determined to set out on a world tour, the hope being that a drastic change in climate would bring about an improvement in his health. It did not, and the trip was cut short when his condition deteriorated in Egypt in late 1894, just a few months into the journey. He and Jenny quickly returned to England, where he died in late January 1895. Randolph's death in 1895 left Jenny a widow in her early 40s. She did not immediately seek to remarry, but rather set out on a literary career herself. This was aided by her social position. For instance, in 1899, she founded and edited the Anglo-Saxon Review, a quarterly miscellany which was published 4 times a year by the London publisher John Lane. It attracted some prominent writers to contribute to it, notably Henry James, and the subscription list included royalty, heads of state, and prominent political families. However, from the beginning it was overpriced, with Jenny's decision to have the journal bound in leather with gilt tooling, ensuring it cost a guinea per volume. It failed after 10 issues. It was also at this time that Jenny became involved in efforts to chair a committee of American women in Britain, with aid from high society within the United States, with the ultimate goal to fund the provision and equipping of a medical ship to be sent to South Africa following the outbreak of the Second Boer War there in 1899. She herself sailed to the British colony on board the hospital ship, the Maine, on its maiden voyage to the war zone. Several years later, in 1908, she also published a memoir entitled The Reminiscences of Lady Randolph Churchill. This was modestly successful in both her adoptive homeland Britain and her nation of birth, the United States. Moreover, at roughly the same time she had authored a play entitled His Borrowed Plumes, which was performed on the London stage in 1909. Jenny remarried twice following the death of her husband. Her second marriage was to George Frederick Middleton Cornwallis West, a prominent officer of the Scots Guards whom she met during her involvement in sending medical aid to South Africa in 1899. Upon her return to Britain, the pair married on the 28th of July 1900. Jenny was 20 years older than her new husband, who was just 2 weeks older himself than her eldest son, Winston. As such, the marriage was frowned upon in some society circles of the time. However, in the end it was not their age difference, but an affair which brought the union gradually to an end. In 1909, when Jenny's play was being performed in London, George began a relationship with Beatrice Rose Campbell, the lead actress in the performance. This was the beginning of a general decline in his and Jenny's marriage. They separated in 1912 and divorced in 1914. This divorce came about just as the First World War was engulfing Europe. Jenny returned to the concerns of the Second Boer War and presided over the American Women's War Hospital at Paignton during its 4 years. She also personally appeared regularly at a hospital at Lancaster Gate in the capital to attend to wounded soldiers recovering there. By the end of 1917, the course of the global conflict was relatively clear as Jenny's homeland, the United States, stepped forth to aid her adoptive country, Britain. It would end in German defeat in November 1918. By that time, Jenny had married Montagu Phippen Porch, a colonial officer who had served in Africa. It seems not to have been a romantic union, but rather one in which both individuals entered into as benefiting their social station. As she herself later noted, "My second marriage was romantic, but not successful. My third marriage was successful, but not romantic." When Montagu returned to his employment in Nigeria shortly after the marriage, she remained in Britain. Jenny's life has understandably been commented upon for her being the mother of Winston Churchill, one of the most significant political figures in modern history. Indeed, she played a role in his political ascent herself. For instance, following the death of her first husband in 1895, she used her social influence and political connections to further her eldest son's growing ambitions. It was through her intervention with the third Marquess of Salisbury that young Winston was sent on an expedition to Sudan, the beginning of an association with British colonization of the continent, which led to Winston serving in the Second Boer War some years later. Despite her support for his political career, the relationship between mother and son was a distant one. Jenny was wrapped up in the complexities of her own affairs, and after a certain point he was in Africa. He would later write of his childhood family life that, on the whole, it was a life of sunshine. But the Churchill children, scholars have speculated, were not the top of their parents' priorities, and quite possibly, Winston's later need for political success and recognition was driven by a quest for the childhood approval which he never acquired. Winston's career was damaged by his role in promoting the catastrophically ill-judged Gallipoli campaign against the Ottoman Empire, but he was nevertheless reascendant in the 1920s and soon became Chancellor of the Exchequer, a role which he can hardly be said to have succeeded in either. However, his mother would not live to see this. In 1921, while her third husband was absent in Africa, she fell down the stairs of a house in Somerset while visiting friends there, breaking her ankle in the process. Gangrene set in afterwards, and this was still largely untreatable as it was a few years before Alexander Fleming would discover the use of penicillin for bacterial infections. Consequently, her leg had to be amputated. However, this drastic measure still did not solve the problem, and she died suddenly at home in London on the 29th of June 1921 at 67 years of age from an arterial hemorrhage in her thigh. She was buried at Blaydon near the town of Woodstock in Oxfordshire. There she was laid to rest next to her first husband. Years after Jenny's death, her son Winston Churchill lost his position as Chancellor of the Exchequer. Following this, he was out of office and faced political exile for around 10 years. This time in his life is known as the Wilderness Years. During these years, Churchill warned the country of the growing threat of Nazi Germany, until he was eventually reappointed as First Lord of the Admiralty in 1939. The following year, he became Prime Minister, leading Britain through the Second World War, playing a key role in stopping the Nazis. Because of this, despite all his faults, he is regarded by many as the greatest Briton to have ever lived. Next, we turn to a woman whose beauty and elegance captivated the British Empire, and who became the Viceroy of Imperial India, Lady Mary Curzon. Mary Victoria Leiter was born in Chicago, Illinois in the United States on the 27th of May 1870. Mary's mother was Mary Teresa Carver and her father was Levi Ziegler Leiter. Mary was the second of 4 siblings, having an older brother named Joseph born in 1868 and 2 younger sisters, Nancy and Margaret, born in 1873 and 1880 respectively. From a young age, Mary's father Levi had become involved in the dry goods business in Ohio before moving out to Chicago. By the time Mary was born in 1870, he had established himself as a prominent figure in the mercantile trade in the city, alongside Marshall Field. Yet, when Mary was just a 1-year-old baby, a terrible fire ravaged her birth city. The Great Chicago Fire, as it has become known, was a conflagration that burned in October 1871, killing 300 people and destroying around 3.3 square miles or 9 square kilometers of the city. As a result, Leiter's store burnt to the ground, but despite this setback, he soon rebuilt, and before long, the Field, Leiter and Company would become the leading dry goods retailers in the whole of the United States. With this, money started pouring in, and the Leiter family soon amassed a huge wealth, equal to hundreds of millions of dollars in today's money. In 1881, Leiter sold his interest to Field and retired from the dry goods business. The name was subsequently changed to Marshall Field and Company. Leiter left the company as he wanted to focus on his significant real estate investments, and so he could move to Washington, D.C. with his family. In the capital, young Mary mainly grew up in a house on DuPont Circle, in a home which had been previously owned by James G. Blaine, a long-serving US Senator who served twice as Secretary of State within the US government. Yet even Blaine's former residence was not considered large enough for Levi Leiter's tastes, and as Mary was growing up, Leiter House, a vast 55-room family residence, was being built in Washington as their new home. However, Mary would not live there for any protracted period of time. As the daughter of a wealthy American businessman, at a time when girls were increasingly viewed as just as deserving of education as boys, Mary received a very respectable one in Washington. She was mostly homeschooled by a series of tutors and governesses, with an emphasis on history, the sciences and the classics, while also learning to dance, sing and play music. Owing to the provision of a French governess, she was also able to speak French fluently by the end of the 1880s. All around, many commented during her adult years on her wit and the breadth of her learning, stating that it gave her the poise and finish that made her so charming to men and women of mature and brilliant intellect. Mary made her society debut in the winter of 1888 after turning 18 years of age. She was noted at the time as a beautiful young woman. This, combined with her social graces and her education, made her an ideal candidate for potentially marrying into the British aristocracy. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, many daughters of wealthy American businessmen were marrying the sons of British aristocrats, becoming known as the American dollar princesses in the process. Such arrangements were mutually beneficial. In many instances, the British family was in need of new money to maintain their fine estates and high society lifestyles in England, having often become severely indebted over the years, while marriage into the British aristocracy conferred on families like the Leiters an element of social status which could not be acquired with money alone in America. In the end, Mary would marry into the Curzons of Kedleston, an aristocratic family which could trace its lineage all the way back to the Norman conquest of England in the 11th century, when the Curzons had travelled from France across the English Channel with William the Conqueror. Mary first met George Curzon in London at a society event in 1890. By then, he was already a 31-year-old Conservative Member of Parliament. Despite the age gap, they quickly began a courtship, one which lasted longer than usual for the times, and led to their marrying on the 22nd of April 1895 in Washington. The early years of Mary and George's marriage were spent in England, where she was soon recognised as a great advantage to Curzon on the campaign trail during the 1895 parliamentary elections. Her wit, social graces and approachability earned Curzon supporters in a relatively tight election to retain his Southport seat. Although Curzon had initially married Mary for her money in order to save his estate, he soon fell deeply in love with her, and it turned out to be a very happy union. During these years, Mary's husband had cultivated a growing reputation as a voice on British policy in Central Asia. The British Raj had expanded over the course of the 19th century into Pakistan and made efforts to annex Afghanistan without success. Another problem was the growing threat of the Russian Empire in the region, as they aimed to expand southwards from the Caspian Sea into Persia and Afghanistan. Curzon had written several works in the 1890s, even as he was courting Mary, on the topic of Persia and the British government's policies in the region more broadly. Indeed, part of Mary's attraction to him seems to have been his interest in Oriental studies. The British government was also interested, and in 1898, on the back of his publications and petitions concerning the region, Curzon was appointed Viceroy of the British Raj, one of the most important political offices in the world at the time. On his appointment, Curzon was made a Baron in the Peerage of Ireland as Baron Curzon of Kedleston, with Mary becoming Baroness Curzon. Together, the couple would head to India, where Mary became Vicereine, a sort of First Lady of British India. The Curzons arrived to the port of Bombay, Britain's oldest possession in India, on the 30th of December 1898. Much to their pleasure, they were greeted by excited crowds and with royal salutes. From there, they proceeded to Calcutta, the capital of British India, where it was estimated that over 100,000 people witnessed their reception at Government House. Almost instantly, Mary was noted for her beauty and respect, being described with great flattery all over India. Although Calcutta was the capital, during the summer months the heat was intense, so the government would retreat to Shimla in northern India, where a significant chunk of the world's population were bizarrely ruled from the side of a small mountain retreat. This would be the Curzons' life for the next 6 years, based largely out of Government House in Calcutta, retiring to Shimla in the summer, and touring the country on occasion as part of their government duties. Mary's role as Viceroy was largely to act as the head of British high society in India. This was a period when the colonial community was somewhat aloof from the common Indian people, and instead her interactions were largely with the wives and daughters of the tens of thousands of British administrators and employees who made up the government of the Raj. In this capacity, she developed a reputation for cultivating high fashion in India and incorporating elements of Indian textiles and styles into her own dress, thus popularizing it amongst the colonial community. This would ultimately have an impact on fashions back in Europe, where designers in London, Paris and other cities were anxious for new ideas about Oriental and Asian fashions. One of the most important aspects of Mary's time as Viceroy was in planning the Delhi Durbar of 1902. This was organised to celebrate the accession of Edward VII as Emperor of India, having become only the second British monarch to be conferred with that title after his mother, Queen Victoria. The site chosen for the ceremony was a deserted plain near the city of Delhi, the native and ancestral capital of India. The Curzons were responsible for overseeing the preparations for a vast military parade and ceremony here in 1902, one which was to act as a statement about British rule in the subcontinent. To their disappointment, however, the king did not himself undertake the journey to India for the event, and instead sent his brother, the Duke of Connaught, to represent him. Yet, this did mean that the Curzons were the centre of attention. On the first day they entered the ceremonial grounds riding on elephants, while the entire Durbar culminated in a coronation ball presided over by Mary and her husband, with her wearing a magnificent set of jewels and a stunning gown made of gold and silver thread called the Peacock Dress. It is said that as she entered the hall, the crowd was breathless, which just goes to show the extent of her beauty and elegance. Mary's marriage resulted in 3 children, all daughters. Irene was the eldest and born in January 1896, not long into their marriage. In later years, she would go on to become a British peer, a socialite and a philanthropist. As a result, she sat in the English House of Lords from 1925 onwards. Despite numerous suitors, she never married or had children. She became involved in many charitable endeavours, notably acting as president of the London Union of Youth Clubs. Mary's second daughter Cynthia was born in 1898. She was possibly the most controversial of the Curzon children, as in 1920 she married Oswald Mosley. At the time he was a rising political star in England with clear abilities, but in the early 1930s he became notorious for founding the British Union of Fascists. She and Oswald had 3 children together, but Cynthia died in 1933 before ever seeing them become adults. As Oswald's political life saw him detained by the British government during the Second World War, Irene ended up acting as a guardian for her children. Finally, Alexandra was born in 1904. She too became involved in the British fascist movement in the 1930s, acting as a go-between for her brother-in-law Mosley, who was also her lover, and the government of Benito Mussolini in Italy through her other lover, Dino Grandi, an Italian ambassador to London. All of this despite the fact that in 1925 she had married Major Edward Dudley Metcalfe, the best friend and equerry of Edward VIII. Mary became known in India for her work as a conservationist, and in many ways she was a pioneer in this field. In particular, she was anxious to stop the overhunting of the white rhinoceros. This came about towards the end of her time as Viceroy of India, after visiting the Kaziranga area to view these animals, but having failed to find a single one. This led Curzon to believe that the animal was in such a depopulated state that even in areas where it used to thrive, there was a huge decline. As a result, she championed the creation of the Kaziranga Reserve Forest, which became the progenitor for today's Kaziranga National Park. Without a doubt, she was ahead of her time in fostering such efforts. By the time Mary was working on her conservation project, her husband was embroiled in an increasingly bitter clash with the head of the British military in India. Herbert Kitchener was one of the great war heroes of the day in the minds of the British public, having won the Battle of Omdurman against the Mahdists of Sudan in 1898 to conquer the region, then faced off against the French at Fashoda, and finally been involved in the suppression of the Second Boer War. Curzon had subsequently petitioned the British government to have him appointed as Commander-in-Chief of British forces in India, but the relationship had soon soured, with Curzon believing that Kitchener's reforms to the British garrison were designed to undermine his authority as Viceroy. By 1904, they were in bitter dispute, but it was ultimately Kitchener who won out. In 1905, he was recalled as Viceroy. He and Mary and their children were heading home. By the time they left India in 1905, Mary's health was already declining. It had diminished during her difficult third pregnancy and an early miscarriage, while the tropical climate in India and the generally arduous schedule which she maintained as Viceroy did little to fix matters. This was further compounded by the lengthy trip back to England after her husband's term as Viceroy ended in 1905. Back there, things did not improve. She died from complications owing to her miscarriage and related surgery at home at Carlton House Terrace in Westminster in London on the 18th of July 1906. She was just 36 years of age. A tragic end to the life of one of the most famed of the so-called dollar princesses. Following Lady Curzon's passing, her distraught husband had a memorial chapel built in honour of her, attached to All Saints, the parish church of Kedleston Hall. In 1917, Lord Curzon went on to marry Grace Elvina Hinds, another prominent American heiress. Lord Curzon eventually died in 1925 and was buried next to his first wife. When his second wife eventually died, she was buried outside the church. It is believed that Mary Curzon and her 3 children served as part of the inspiration for the fictitious Lady Grantham and her 3 daughters in the ITV hit series Downton Abbey. Our next story takes us back to the dollar princess who made history not just through marriage, but by breaking political ground as Britain's first female MP, Nancy Astor. Nancy Witcher Langhorne was born at Langhorne House in Danville, Virginia on the 19th of May 1879. She was the 8th of 11 children born to her mother Nancy Witcher Keene and her father, Chiswell Danby Langhorne. The Langhornes were an old southern family of considerable wealth, having made their riches in the 18th and 19th centuries from slave labour and the booming production of tobacco and cotton, the backbone of the plantation economy. The Langhornes had also expanded into railway construction during the booming 1840s and 1850s. But Chiswell Langhorne's business empire crumbled after the Civil War and the abolition of slavery, leaving the family in steep decline. By the time Nancy was born in 1879, the Langhornes had endured years of hardship for the first time in many decades. Chiswell soon managed to turn things around though. Using his family's long-established business contacts, he acquired some significant railway construction contracts in the southern states during the years of post-Civil War Reconstruction, and used these to build up the Langhornes' wealth in the late 1870s and into the 1880s. By the early 1890s, as Nancy blossomed into her teenage years, the Langhornes had triumphantly clawed their way back to wealth and social prominence. By the early 1890s, Nancy spent much of her time between the Langhornes' new manor in Virginia and the family's residence in New York, a city where every powerful dynasty of America's Gilded Age had a grand residence. There, Nancy attended a finishing school for young women, and she was trained in everything from the classics and foreign languages to dancing and social graces. The Langhorne sisters would later become famous for both their beauty and education, and as you will see, Nancy in particular would prove her sharp intellect in years to come, though never without stirring her fair share of controversy. While still a teenager in New York, Nancy met Robert Gould Shaw II, an heir to a wealthy Boston family celebrated for its contributions to the Union cause during the Civil War. They married in Manhattan on October 27, 1897, just months after Nancy had turned 18. Unfortunately, their marriage was troubled almost from the very start. Robert was 7 years older than Nancy, but it wasn't their age difference that caused the problems in their marriage. Even the birth of a son, Robert Jr., in 1898 could not save it, and by 1901 the couple had separated. Friends of Robert painted Nancy as a puritanical control freak who smothered her husband, while Nancy's acquaintances argued that the marriage ended because Robert was an alcoholic womanizer. In truth, both sides may have been right. Heartbroken but determined, Nancy set out to reinvent herself, an ambition that would soon carry her across the Atlantic and into history. Nancy didn't officially divorce Robert until 1903, a year marked by another heartbreak, with the death of her mother. Grieving and adrift, she returned to Virginia to live at her father's house. In 1904, eager for a fresh start, Nancy set off on a tour of England, bringing her young son Bobby with her, over whom she had gained full custody. And she quickly fell in love with England. Sensing her reluctance, and seeing how happy she was abroad, her father encouraged her to move there permanently, telling her it had been her mother's wish as well. To ease the transition, he even suggested that she take her younger sister Phyllis along for the adventure. It wasn't long until Nancy was known in English society as a witty and intriguing American. She had arrived at a time when wealthy young American women were famously marrying into the British aristocracy to gain social standing, the so-called dollar princesses. Because of this ongoing trend, she was once asked, "Have you come to get our husbands?" To which Nancy shot back, "If you knew the trouble I had getting rid of mine." This remark instantly charmed the room, and hinted at her quick wit that would soon make her a star of London society. Funnily enough, it wasn't long until Nancy found herself a new husband. In 1905 she met Waldorf Astor, the son of William Waldorf, Viscount Astor, a major American-British businessman and philanthropist. He had inherited a significant fortune from his father, John Jacob Astor III, and later amassed more wealth through various business ventures, most notably through a hotel empire, which still spans the world today. Coincidentally, Nancy and Waldorf were the exact same age, both born on the same day in 1879, and he'd also been born in the States, though he had grown up in Britain. They developed a close relationship and were married in 1906, when they were both 27 years old. When Waldorf's father passed away in 1919, they would become Lord and Lady Astor, and this title would stay with Nancy for the rest of her life. The couple mainly lived in London after marrying, where they had a lavish townhouse on St. James's Square, splitting their time between there and a large country estate in Buckinghamshire. Unlike her first marriage, Nancy's relationship with Waldorf was a happy one. He was a devoted and loving husband, and they eventually had 5 children together: William Waldorf, born in 1907, Nancy Phyllis, born in 1909, Francis David, born in 1912, Michael, born in 1916, and a 4th boy, John Jacob, born in 1918. This life allowed Nancy to flourish as a prominent hostess among the social elite, but her ambition didn't stop there, setting the stage for her entry into a much larger arena: British politics. Nancy Astor is most well known today as being the first female Member of Parliament in British parliamentary history, or at least, the first female MP to take her seat. In actual fact, it was Constance Markievicz of Ireland who was the first female MP, having been elected to Westminster in 1918. Yet, she never took her seat in Parliament. This was because she was a member of the Sinn Féin party, which refused to take their seats in London, instead forming a breakaway parliament in Dublin. From early on in their marriage, Nancy had encouraged her husband to attempt a career in politics. He was successful in this, and in 1918 he was the MP for Plymouth Sutton. Yet, with the death of his father in 1919, Waldorf became the second Viscount Astor, becoming a member of the House of Lords, forcing him to give up his seat. This triggered a by-election in the Plymouth Sutton constituency, and with the success of the recent suffrage movement in Britain, Nancy seized the opportunity, campaigning for the seat. At 40 years of age, she won the by-election in November 1919, making history as the first woman to take a seat in the British Parliament. Nancy Astor would hold her seat for the next 26 years. As we will see, she was known to be cruel, and her time as an MP was often quite controversial, but it was also marked by significant accomplishments. She joined as a member of the Conservative and Unionist Party, known simply as the Conservatives, and colloquially as the Tories. In the late 1920s, Lady Astor campaigned on a number of issues like protecting women from mistreatment, advocating for fairer treatment of teenagers in court, and supporting efforts to assist vulnerable women and single mothers in London and other major cities. Astor also championed other women entering politics, serving from 1924 as the first president of the Electoral Association for Women, which promoted female involvement in politics in Britain and the US. In the interwar years, she emerged as one of Parliament's leading feminist figures, her most lasting legacy. But as the political climate darkened, Lady Astor's views would take a far more controversial turn. If the 1920s were a period of promise and accomplishment for Nancy in political life, the 1930s were the direct opposite. In an age of growing political extremism across the Western world, she became increasingly vocal in her support for a wide range of controversial political positions. For instance, Nancy was fiercely opposed to Roman Catholicism, a prejudice shaped by the wave of Irish and Italian immigration to America between the 1840s and 1920s. However, her hardline views clashed with the more tolerant and secular attitudes that were taking hold in Britain. As damaging as her anti-Catholicism was, though, it is eclipsed in retrospect by the controversy surrounding her views on the Jewish people. There is no denying that Nancy Astor was an anti-Semite. This attitude, though, was far from unusual in Europe during the interwar years. It's important to remember that as the Nazi regime escalated its persecution of the Jewish people in the 1930s, both the British and American governments only offered limited support to refugees fleeing Germany and Austria. But Nancy Astor's anti-Semitism ran even deeper. She believed in a popular conspiracy theory of the time that claimed Jews were secretly working with socialists and communists to tear down Western society and build a new world order. In the late 1930s, Nancy Astor formed a notorious alliance with Joseph Kennedy Sr., the US ambassador to Britain and father of President John F. Kennedy. Apparently, Astor even suggested to Kennedy that Nazi persecution of the Jews was not enough to justify dragging Britain and America into war. She also maintained a cordial relationship with Joachim von Ribbentrop, the Nazi ambassador to Britain, speaking favourably of him during the late 1930s. But these extremist views would eventually push her into political isolation, marking the beginning of the end for her career. The outbreak of the Second World War in 1939 and the entry of the United States into the conflict in December 1941 saw Lady Astor cast into the political wilderness, as her favourable earlier stance on the Nazis was dragged up by her political opponents. These political difficulties were compounded by personal adversity, as she lost family members and had to deal with the increasingly erratic behaviour of her son from her first marriage, who had acquired his father's affinity for excessive drinking. Astor did little to repair her reputation as the war dragged on, and her controversial remarks only fueled public anger. She was widely criticised for suggesting that British soldiers fighting on the Southern Front, particularly in Italy, were cowards trying to avoid the more dangerous battles in northern France after D-Day. This, combined with her unrepentant views on ethnic and religious minorities, and her stance towards the Jewish people, even as the horrors of the Holocaust were being revealed across Europe in 1944 and 1945, led the Conservative Party leaders to conclude that she was a liability. When Prime Minister Winston Churchill called a snap election just weeks after the war ended in the summer of 1945, Nancy Astor was bluntly told she would have no support if she tried to run again, not from her party, and not even from her own family. Her husband warned her that if she stood for office, she would be standing alone. Furious and humiliated, she was forced to step aside. After 26 years in Parliament, Nancy Astor's political career ended not with applause, but with resentment and regret. And her downfall was just the beginning of a long and lonely final chapter. Nancy's retirement from politics left her deeply embittered. At public events, she often lashed out, blaming the Conservative leadership for forcing her out of Parliament. As Britain grew more liberal, Nancy's old-fashioned views seemed increasingly out of step, and her bitterness took a heavy toll on her marriage. She and Waldorf began travelling separately, and soon were living apart. Yet, despite the rift, the two reconciled shortly before Waldorf's death on the 30th of September 1952. He was 73 years old when he passed. Nancy Astor lived to be 84 years of age, dying in Grimsthorpe Castle in England on the 2nd of May 1964. Her last years were ones of isolation. All of her many siblings had died before her, and Nancy's relationship with her children became strained to the point of having little or no contact with them. Though her daughter Nancy did care for her in her final illness. Today, Nancy Astor's legacy is a battlefield of contradictions. To some, she remains a feminist icon and trailblazer who shattered political barriers for women. To others, she is remembered as an unrepentant anti-Semite whose bigotry stains her accomplishments. The truth is, she was both a pioneer and a deeply flawed character. For our final tale, we are going back to one of the earliest and most successful dollar princesses, but also someone who is often overlooked in history, Consuelo Montague. Consuelo Isnaga was born on an unknown date in 1853 as Francisca Maria de la Consolación Isnaga in New York City, though she would be known throughout her life as Consuelo. She was the second of 4 children born to Antonio Modesta Isnaga del Valle and his wife Ella Maria Isnaga, née Clement. They had 3 other children, a son Fernando born in 1850 and 2 daughters named Natica and Emily, born in 1856 and 1859 respectively. Consuelo's family were wealthy on both sides. Her father Antonio hailed from a dynasty of rich Cubans who had run sugar plantations on the island for generations, during a time when the sugar trade was enormously lucrative. They also had ties going back to before the family's migration to Cuba to the Spanish aristocracy. But their wealth was blood money, having been accumulated on the back of the slave trade, which was used to power the sugar industry in the Caribbean for centuries. Consuelo's mother's family's wealth came from more ethical sources. The Clements of Dutchess County in New York had begun to prosper not long before Consuelo's birth. This was thanks to their early investment in the new technology of steamboats, which they would run around the Hudson River and the surrounding waters of Manhattan and Greater New York. This soon became a prosperous industry which made the fortunes of many individuals of Gilded Age America, not least Cornelius Vanderbilt, later the richest man in the United States and possibly the world. Consuelo was largely raised on the Ravenswood plantation in Concordia Parish in Louisiana, her family having retained properties not just in New York and Cuba, but in the southern states and on Rhode Island. It was an affluent upbringing with governesses to run the household and private tutors. Although many details of her early life are shadowy, it is clear from her later interests and from accounts of those who knew her that Consuelo was well educated. As the Isnagas' wealth increased in the second half of the 19th century, they were increasingly courted by the British aristocracy to establish marital ties. This was an age in which a large proportion of Britain's oldest noble houses had found themselves in financial difficulties after years or even centuries of maintaining lavish households in London and country estates. Many families had suffered from reckless individuals squandering parts of their fortune, playing cards in the capital, or even investing in speculative economic activities. For instance, the railway boom and bust of the 1840s had impoverished many formerly affluent dynasties in Britain. It was in this environment that many of these same families began marrying their sons and daughters to those of newly wealthy American families. It was a two-way street. The British families would acquire relief from their financial straits, and the American families would acquire the social gravitas, which came with marrying into the British aristocracy. The Isnagas were soon heavily involved in this phenomenon. But why? You would think their vast fortune and Antonio's historic wealth would give them all the prestige they would need. Yet it didn't. The Isnagas' Cuban heritage and the fact that Clement was new money meant that they were generally excluded from American high society. Like most wealthy families from the time, they were desperate for social acceptance and saw Consuelo as their way in. So, although she didn't know it yet, Consuelo would soon be heading across the Atlantic Ocean to marry a British suitor, becoming part of the first wave of the American dollar princesses as they became known. As she entered her late teenage years in the early 1870s, Consuelo was introduced to New York's social scene and was soon a well-liked figure, both for her beauty and her wit. While she did move in the circles with some of the daughters of the richest families of the day, such as the Vanderbilts and the Jeromes, she and her family still weren't accepted by the very top of New York society. Those who were excluded from this elite class would marry British heirs in due course. The lives of these young women from their early days in New York in the 1870s were memorably captured years later in Edith Wharton's book The Buccaneers. She based her characters on real American heiresses, with her friend Consuelo being one of them. In New York, Consuelo reunited with her childhood best friend Alva Erskine Smith, who she had grown up with in the South before the Civil War. Alva would soon marry William Kissam Vanderbilt, and it was Consuelo who introduced the two in the first place. When Alva's first child was born, she made Consuelo the godmother, and even named her baby girl after her. I am of course talking about Consuelo Vanderbilt, the famed American heiress who married the 9th Duke of Marlborough and saved Blenheim Palace. In the mid-1870s, a match was proposed for Consuelo to marry George Victor Drogo Montagu, Viscount Mandeville. He was the heir of William Montagu, 7th Duke of Manchester, one of Britain's premier aristocratic lines. His lineage could be traced back all the way to the 11th century, when the founder of the dynasty, Drogo de Montagu, had accompanied William the Conqueror to England in 1066 as part of the Norman conquest of the country. But they, like so many other noble lines, were increasingly impoverished in the 19th century and were finding it difficult to maintain the lavish lifestyle to which they had previously become accustomed. Consuelo's marriage to George on the 22nd of May 1876 at Grace Church in Manhattan in New York changed all of that. He acquired a $6 million dowry through the union, an enormous sum, equivalent to over $150 million in today's money, while the Isnagas became a social sensation in New York City and acquired links to the British aristocracy. Consuelo first met the Viscount at a party, and from the very start she fell deeply in love with George. It seemed like a perfect match. Nevertheless, these affections, it seems, only went one way. Also, Montagu's parents didn't approve of the marriage, and even tried to prevent it. Not only did she have to deal with hostility from her in-laws, but George was unfaithful, and there was always tension in their union. These were exacerbated by his spending habits, laying out large sums of money on mistresses, attending music halls in London and gambling. Eventually, George's father, the Duke of Manchester, exiled them to the family lands in Ireland, hoping that George would stop his excessive spending there. Ireland did little to curb George's extravagance, but it was here that they started a family. 3 children were born. William arrived in 1877. He would become the Duke of Manchester himself one day. Then in 1879, 2 daughters arrived, bookending the year on either side. Jacqueline Mary, known as May, came first, followed by Alice Eleanor, who the family referred to as Nell. It was around this time that Consuelo's mother Ellen took her unmarried daughters to London to introduce them to society. It was there that Maria de la Natividad, or Natica as she was known to her family, met and married Sir John Lister Kay, 3rd Baronet Lister Kay. She injected money into the family's mixed economic fortunes, but despite that things only got worse, and in 1914, Sir John was before the bankruptcy court in London, having made investments in property in the Balkans, which turned sour as the wars there escalated in the 1910s. In 1883, Consuelo's friend Alva hosted an extravagant costume ball to finally break into New York high society, which was being gate-kept by Mrs. Astor. The party was a huge success, and rocked the world of Gilded Age New York's social elite. This would have been a much-needed break from the sad life Consuelo faced back in England, especially as she was named the guest of honour. It was also that year that the Duke allowed the family to return to England, though by that time, George had squandered much of the dowry money he had acquired through his marriage to Consuelo. In England, Consuelo remained miserable. Her husband was often away from home, leaving her all alone to try and navigate the complicated English upper classes. Yet, she soon befriended other American heiresses, and in time they became the favourites of Bertie, the Prince of Wales, and the future King Edward VII. Together, the American heiresses would host intimate dinner parties and card soirees, with Consuelo playing the banjo and telling risque stories while smoking a cigar. The Prince of Wales thoroughly enjoyed her company, as did his wife Alexandra of Denmark, and with this, every door in England began to open for Consuelo. In 1890, the 7th Duke of Manchester died and was succeeded by George. By that time, he and Consuelo were largely living apart, with George having taken up residence with one of his mistresses, Bessie Bellwood. This had been reported on in the papers and humiliated Consuelo, despite the fact that by then she was a high society favourite. Upon his acquisition of the dukedom, he did decide to renounce Bessie and attempt the appearance of a normal family life, but it was short-lived in any event. He died in August 1892, just 2 years after becoming duke, from cirrhosis of the liver brought on by his hard living and borderline alcoholism. Thus, Consuelo's son William ascended as 9th Duke of Manchester at just 15 years of age. However, money was still an issue. To remedy this, Consuelo began to help other American heiresses to find a titled British husband, just as she had helped her younger sister. Consuelo would offer etiquette lessons, advise their heiresses and their mothers on what to wear, and even where to rent a house for the season. Consuelo also hosted tea and dinners so the young women could be introduced to eligible bachelors. The most famous match Consuelo played a part in was in that of her goddaughter, Consuelo Vanderbilt. Her marriage to the 9th Duke of Marlborough in November 1895 captivated New York society and inspired countless headlines during its lead-up. The wedding was deemed the social event of the year, and Alva rewarded Consuelo handsomely for her help, which somewhat eased her financial situation. Consuelo is associated today with the Manchester tiara, which was produced by the Diamond House Cartier for her in 1903. It features 7 heart motifs of diamonds set into gold and silver frames, with 3 dangling diamonds at the centre of each heart, all topped by a detachable scroll on a single collet diamond. In order for it to be produced, Consuelo provided Cartier with over 1,000 diamonds, which were added to by Cartier as well. It was all an indication of the profligate spending of the members of the Montague family, which, as we will see presently, had implications for their heirs which have continued down to the present day. As Dowager Duchess of Manchester, Consuelo continued to live in the 1890s and 1900s at Kimbolton House in Cambridgeshire, the Montagues' long-established family seat, as she raised her son to take on the duties of the dukedom in a more responsible fashion than her husband had. Yet, unfortunately, William would grow up to be just as spendthrift and reckless with money as his father had been. Consuelo's years as a widow were also blighted by family tragedy. Tuberculosis had emerged as one of the most brutal diseases in the developed world during the 19th century. In 1895, it claimed her elder daughter May, while 5 years later, it also led to Nell's death. Thus, Consuelo was left with just William amongst her children as a new century dawned. These tragedies were only partially offset following the accession of her friend King Edward VII in 1901. Her financial woes were also relieved in 1902 when her brother died, having left her $2 million in his will, which is around $70 million today. In the mid-1900s, Consuelo developed neuritis, a condition which results in severe inflammation of the central and peripheral nervous systems. This eventually took her life on the 20th of November 1909 in her mid-50s. Her sisters and friends were by her side when she passed. Prior to her death, she was living at Grosvenor Square and was attended by Sir Alfred Fripp, surgeon in ordinary to King Edward. During this time, the king was known to frequently ask about her condition. Despite her husband and son's spending habits, she had an estate of £2.5 million at the time of her death, which she granted away to various causes and family members. She also bequeathed her ruby and diamond bracelet to Her Majesty Queen Alexandra as a token of her affection and regard. After her passing, Consuelo's body was placed into a coffin and covered with beautiful wreaths, where it was taken by train from London to Kimbolton, where a funeral took place on the 24th of November. In London, a memorial service was held on the same day at the Chapel Royal in St James's Palace. After her death, Consuelo's immediate family and her sisters' and brothers' families often ran into financial difficulties, compounded by divorces, heavy spending, and accumulated debts and loans. The 10th Duke of Manchester, Consuelo's grandson, was forced to sell the family's ancestral seat, Kimbolton Castle, in 1951. The 12th Duke later served a prison sentence for committing fraud, and the 13th Duke for attempted burglary. Eventually, in 2007, the famous Manchester tiara, Consuelo's prized piece of jewellery, and a symbol of the wealth which the Montagus had injected into the Manchester dynasty, was given to the British government in exchange for relief for extensive inheritance taxes which the family owed. It is housed in the Victorian Albert Museum in London today, a testament to the folly which often surrounded the marriage arrangements concerning American dollar princesses like Consuelo Montagu. Thank you so much for watching this video on the dollar princesses and this deep dive into each of their lives. I hope you found it interesting. Let me know what you thought of their lives down below in the comments, and if you have any suggestions or want more videos like this or on topics similar to this, also let me know down below in the comments. I hope you guys are subscribed and have notifications turned on to get all my videos as soon as I upload them. Anyway, that's all from me, so I'll see all of you in the next Forgotten Life. Thanks.